It was just past 9 a.m. when the doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse opened to the public, and by 9:15, the gallery was full. Reporters lined the back of the room, their cameras lowered but ready. Locals filled the wooden benches, murmuring among themselves as they waited for the most controversial trial the small town had seen in years. The name on the docket, Daniel Mercer. Once regarded as a trusted youth mentor and community volunteer, he now stood accused of a crime that had divided the town right down the middle. At the front of the courtroom, the judge's bench stood tall, casting a long shadow across the witness box. The room was quiet, heavy with anticipation. Prosecutors had built a case with fragments of witness testimony, thin strands of circumstantial evidence, and a few photographs recovered during a late night raid on an old farmhouse. But there was no confession, no direct eyewitness, just enough to leave the jury uncertain and the public anxious. Then, quietly and without any announcement, a small child was led into the courtroom. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Her dark curls bounced as she clung to a worn teddy bear, her small fingers wrapped tightly around its matted ear. She walked slowly beside a woman from Child Services, who gently guided her toward the front of the room. No one had expected a child so young to appear at the trial, especially not one who had been kept out of the media entirely until now. Her name was Lila, and most people in the courtroom had no idea who she was yet. She didn't look around. She didn't cry. She simply climbed up onto the wooden bench and sat quietly, her eyes locked on something across the room. Few feet from the witness stand stood a large, calm German shepherd. His posture was perfectly still, ears alert, eyes focused. This was Rex, a highly trained police canine, stationed in the courtroom not to intimidate, but to provide emotional support to potential child witnesses. He had served for nearly 6 years under Officer Mallory, and he was known for his uncanny ability to sense distress in children. To most of the people in the courtroom, Rex was just part of the background, an extra layer of comfort, a distraction, for a child who might be called to speak. But to Lila, he was something entirely different. At first, she stared at him quietly, not moving. Her little legs swung gently beneath the bench. Then she stood up, very slowly, still holding her teddy bear against her chest. She pointed one small finger directly at Rex. The courtroom noticed. Conversations halted. A few heads turned toward the child in curiosity. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "He knows." The words sliced through the silence like glass. For a second, no one moved. The judge blinked, looking toward the child advocate. The prosecutor furrowed his brow. The defense attorney immediately raised an objection, uncertain to what exactly, but sensing the tide in the room was shifting. What did she say? Someone whispered from the back. Lila repeated herself, louder this time. "He knows." Rex's ears twitched. His eyes turned toward the little girl. Then he calmly walked forward and sat directly in front of her, gazing up as she gently reached down to touch his fur. Officer Mallory, startled but composed, gave Rex a small hand signal. Rex didn't move. The judge cleared her throat and leaned slightly forward. "Let the record note the child's statement," she said firmly. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Lila didn't flinch. She kept her hand resting on Rex's head as if he were the only safe thing in the room. And just like that, the entire case began to shift because a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a dog and said 2 words that no one could explain, yet no one could ignore. 15 minutes passed, but no one left the courtroom. The reporters stayed rooted in place, exchanging glances, unsure whether to reach for their notepads or just sit and absorb what they had witnessed. The jury had been ushered out during the recess, but whispers filled the space they left behind. Everyone had the same question on their lips. What did she mean by, "he knows"? In the judge's chambers, Officer Mallory stood beside Rex, whose leash rested loosely in his hand. The German shepherd had returned to a calm posture, his eyes scanning the hallway as though still on duty. Across the room, the child services worker sat beside little Lila on a cushioned bench. Lila leaned her head against Rex's thick fur, her teddy bear momentarily forgotten on the floor. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even scared. She just looked settled, peaceful. But no one knew why Judge Ramirez had requested the brief meeting to understand what was unfolding before her. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with 22 years of experience on the bench. She had seen children testify before. She had seen breakdowns, refusals to speak, tears, and trauma. But never had she seen a child point to a dog and say something that held an entire courtroom hostage in silence. The child advocate, Miss Jenna Colburn, leaned forward and spoke softly. She hasn't spoken in months. Not one word. Not to me. Not to her therapist. We suspected trauma-related mutism after she was rescued in January. But this is the first time she said anything meaningful. Judge Ramirez narrowed her eyes. Rescued? Officer Mallory turned. Yes, Your Honor. She was found during a multi-agency raid on a farmhouse out near County Line Road, a neglected, hidden basement room. She was barely clothed, malnourished. We brought her to the hospital immediately. I didn't realize. Wait. He looked down at Rex. He was part of that rescue. He was the one who found her. We were sweeping the property when Rex alerted to the back wall of the living room. Behind a shelf, there was a trapdoor. I remember now Lila was underneath, hiding under blankets. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at him. And she hasn't spoken since. Miss Colburn nodded slowly. She was unresponsive for weeks. Didn't even respond to her own name. But when she saw Rex today, something opened. The realization hit them all at once, that it wasn't coincidence, that it wasn't random. Lila remembered Rex, and Rex remembered her. Judge Ramirez tapped a pen against her folder, deep in thought. I want the child psychologist to sit with her immediately. Get an emergency session. If she's ready to talk, even partially, we have a duty to listen. No pressure. No formal questioning. Just support. As Rex gently lay down beside Lila, resting his head on her foot, the girl gave a soft giggle. It was the first sound of joy she had made in front of any adult in over 3 months. Back in the courtroom, the buzz had turned into speculation. Defense attorneys were quietly meeting with their client, concerned. The prosecution huddled with investigators. The air was thick with uncertainty. At that moment, the bailiff returned with a quiet message. The child is willing to speak, but only if the dog stays with her. Permission was granted. What had started as a standard trial with witnesses, paperwork, and distant theories was now spiraling into something deeper. A lost memory had been stirred. A child had finally found her voice. And somehow, impossibly, the key to it all was a German shepherd trained not just to protect the public, but to break down walls that no human could. Officer Mallory looked down at Rex again and whispered, You knew, didn't you, boy? Rex didn't move. He just stared at the door, waiting for Lila to come back in and for the truth to finally follow. The interview room was small but warm, filled with soft lighting, plush chairs, and a low table scattered with crayons and picture books. It had been prepared in a hurry, but it looked nothing like the courtroom Lila had just left behind. There were no stern faces or heavy doors, just quiet, a scent of lavender from the wall diffuser, and one familiar figure by her side. Rex lay beside Lila on a padded mat, calm as ever. His eyes followed her movements, and his breathing remained steady. The therapist, Dr. Marla Bennett, sat across from them with a soft smile, and a clipboard she hadn't written a word on yet. Her voice was low and gentle. "Hi, Lila. My name is Marla. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, okay? I'm just going to sit with you while you draw." Lila didn't respond with words. She reached for a blue crayon and began scribbling on a page without looking up. But she wasn't aimless. Her strokes were careful, deliberate. Slowly, the shape of a ring began to take form. A circle with a blue stone in the center. Marla watched, glancing once at the child advocate Jenna, who gave her a subtle nod. It was a detail no one had fed to Lila. After a few minutes, Marla asked quietly, "What color is that?" "Blue," Lila said without hesitation. It was the first word she had spoken in the session, and the first sign her memory was surfacing. Marla took a small breath and leaned in slightly. "That's a beautiful drawing. Is that a ring?" Lila nodded. "Whose ring is it, sweetie?" Layla didn't answer right away. Instead, she pressed her hand into Rex's fur and looked up at Marla for the first time. Her eyes weren't blank anymore. They held something heavier awareness, maybe even understanding. "The man with candy had that ring," she said. "He told me not to talk." The room froze. Jenna's hand clutched her clipboard a little tighter. Marla stayed calm, nodding gently. "Thank you for telling me, Lila. That was very brave." Lila kept going. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "He had a scratchy voice and a big coat. And he made me stay in the room with the green light. It smelled like dirt. There was music sometimes. But the dog came. He broke the door. The bad man ran." Tears welled in Jenna's eyes, though she turned her face slightly so Lila wouldn't see. Marla scribbled quick notes, amazed at the level of detail. "Can you remember anything else about the ring?" Lila tapped the drawing. "He always wore it, even when he brought the candy. The blue stone, the coat, the smell of the room, the green light." Every piece matched fragments that investigators had collected, but never been able to confirm. Now, the puzzle was starting to complete itself, and it was coming straight from a child who, only hours earlier, had been considered too young and too traumatized to help Dot. And then came the moment that stopped Marla cold. Lila pointed to Rex and said, "He was the first one not to scare me." Rex raised his head slightly, as if he'd heard his name, and gave her a gentle nudge with his nose. She giggled again, then looked directly at Marla and added, "He pulled me out of the dark." Marla didn't need more confirmation. She turned to the observer behind the mirror and gave a clear signal. The session had yielded more than anyone had dared hope. Back in the main courthouse, the prosecution was reviewing everything. Lila's words, paired with Rex's known involvement in the raid, painted a clearer picture than any witness testimony had so far. A motion was being filed to allow the recorded interview into evidence. The judge, still cautious, but increasingly convinced, agreed to review it privately first. And in a quiet hallway just outside the courtroom, Rex sat beside Lila once again, calm and faithful. Only now, the world was finally ready to listen to what she had tried so hard to forget. Judge Ramirez sat alone in her chambers late into the evening, reviewing the video footage. The lights were dimmed. The rest of the courthouse had gone quiet for the night, but she stayed, transfixed by the quiet voice of a little girl who had, without realizing it, just changed everything. On the screen, Lila sat curled next to Rex, calmly drawing the blue ring, describing the man with candy, and recalling the trapdoor, the green light, the dirt smell, all of it lined up with evidence from the Fairmouse raid. But it was the moment she whispered, "He told me no one would believe me," that truly hit the judge. There was no hesitation in her tone, no hint of invention. This was not fantasy. This was memory. By morning, Judge Ramirez approved the footage for submission. With the child psychologist's interpretation and validation, the testimony would be presented to the jury carefully, sensitively, and with the utmost respect for Lila's age and condition. The defense pushed back, calling it unverifiable. But their protest held no weight. The judge had made her decision. It would be seen when court resumed that afternoon. There was an uneasy tension in the air. Everyone knew something had shifted. Lila was not in the courtroom, but Rex was. He sat near Officer Mallory, watching the proceedings with that familiar steady gaze. Mallory gave him a gentle pat and whispered, "This is your moment, buddy." The prosecutor, Miss Dana Weller, addressed the jury. Her voice was clear, steady, and unshakable. "We're about to show you a video. It is not graphic, but it is powerful. The child in this footage, previously unable to speak, came forward not because anyone forced her, but because she saw someone, or rather, something that gave her back her voice. A trained police dog, present in this courtroom, was part of the rescue that brought her out of that basement. That connection, and her memory of it, is what allowed her to speak. The video played. The room was still. Even the scribbling of the reporters stopped. All eyes locked on the screen as Lila's small voice filled the room. Every detail she gave lined up perfectly with items found in the farmhouse. The blue ring, the green glow of the emergency light hanging from the ceiling, the old coat, the voice. When she said, "He helped me out of the dark," there were audible sniffles in the gallery. The jury shifted in their seats. One woman covered her mouth. A man wiped his eyes. Even Judge Ramirez blinked slowly, letting the moment land with full weight. Then came the second half of the presentation. The prosecution brought forward photographic evidence. A close-up of Daniel Mercer's ring, seized the night of his arrest. A silver band with a dark blue gem embedded in its center. Identical to Lila's crayon drawing. The room buzzed again. Mercer, who had sat smug and stone-faced for much of the trial, shifted visibly in his seat for the first time. His lawyer leaned in, whispering quickly, but Mercer didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the screen, as if he could will it away. "This is not just a drawing," Dana Weller said, holding up a printed image of Lila's artwork. "This is a child who remembers what happened to her, who identified a ring no one had mentioned to her. A ring that matches one worn by the accused. A child who found the courage to speak only when she was reunited with the dog who pulled her from the dark." Silence followed. For the first time since the trial began, the jury no longer looked unsure. And though the child wasn't in the courtroom to see it, her voice, once lost, was echoing in every corner of the room. The courtroom doors opened the next morning to a much different crowd. More spectators had arrived, some with notepads, some with tissues in hand. Word had spread. A little girl's voice, revived by a police dog, had just turned the trial upside down. For the first time since the case began, the town was watching not with doubt, but with hope. The defense looked rattled. Attorney Mitchell Blake had been confident for weeks. With no direct witness testimony, no DNA, and no confession, he believed the case would eventually collapse under its own weight. But now, the game had changed. The jury had seen the ring. They'd heard Lila's description. And the presence of the K-9 officer, this calm, watchful dog named Rex, had become more than symbolic. He had become the silent thread stitching together a story the world was finally beginning to understand. In a move that surprised even the court staff, the judge allowed a brief live session with Lila, not to testify, but to be seen. She entered quietly, walking beside her child advocate and Officer Mallory, with Rex by her side. No cameras were allowed. No one spoke. The moment was not about evidence. It was about presence. Lila wore a small blue ribbon in her hair, the same shade as the crayon she had used to draw the ring. She didn't look nervous. She didn't even look scared. She walked straight to the front bench, sat down, and placed her hand on Rex's back like she had done it 100 times before. Rex leaned gently into her dot. The jury watched, some with tears in their eyes. And though no words were spoken, the scene said everything. After a few quiet minutes, Judge Ramirez softly thanked Lila for coming. The little girl gave a shy nod and walked out with Rex, her fingers never leaving his fur. Later that day, Officer Mallory was called to the stand. He stood straight in uniform, his voice clear and calm as he answered questions about the raid that had taken place months earlier, the one that led to Lila's rescue. He described the farmhouse in detail, the way Rex had alerted on the trapdoor, the way they'd found the child huddled under old blankets in a space barely large enough for her to stretch out. She didn't scream. He said she didn't speak, but she looked straight at Rex, and she didn't look away. The prosecutor nodded. And did Rex interact with her? Yes, carefully. He approached slowly, laid down beside her, and waited. When she finally moved, it was toward him. She wrapped her arms around his neck and stayed that way until we carried her out. Did you have any idea, at the time, that she might be a key witness in a future trial? No, Mallory admitted. We were just relieved she was alive. The defense tried to cross-examine, suggesting that the dog's presence was a form of emotional manipulation for the jury. But that argument didn't hold. Mallory calmly reminded the court that Rex had been approved by the state for emotional support in child trauma cases and had never been used to intimidate or dramatize proceedings. And then came the final moment. Of the day, the introduction of a new piece of evidence. A second photo, recently recovered from the farmhouse's attic, showing Daniel Mercer wearing the same blue ring. Standing beside him was an old recliner, and next to that, unmistakably, the same emergency green light fixture Lila had described. The jury collectively leaned forward. No one spoke, but the shift was visible. This wasn't a theory anymore. It was a timeline, a connection, a map that had started in silence and was now lit by details. No one could deny Rex remained in the courtroom as the session ended, his calm demeanor never breaking. He wasn't barking. He wasn't pacing. He was watching. And with each passing day, it was becoming clearer. This dog hadn't just saved a girl's life. He was helping her save justice itself. The tension in the courtroom was at its peak. By now, everyone had formed their own opinions. Spectators clung to every moment. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the jury grew more attentive with each piece of evidence. What started as a shaky case with limited evidence had slowly transformed into a powerful, emotional unraveling of truth. And at the center of it all, a child, a dog, and a memory that refused to stay buried. On the 5th day of the trial, the prosecution called their final expert, Dr. Marla Bennett, the child psychologist who had interviewed Lila after her spontaneous breakthrough. Calm and articulate, she stepped up to the witness stand, holding a folder filled with her notes. She had interviewed dozens of traumatized children in her career, but as she explained, Lila was different. She had withdrawn completely from speech after the incident, Dr. Bennett said. What we often see in children who suffer intense trauma at such a young age is something called selective mutism. It's not that they forget, it's that their voice becomes locked behind fear. The courtroom was dead silent. What made Lila unlock? The prosecutor asked. Dr. Bennett turned her head slightly and looked toward Rex, who was lying just beside the bar, separating the gallery from the trial floor. His head was resting on his front paws, but his eyes were open, observing. It was the dog, she answered. Rex. The moment she saw him, her body language changed. Her memory stirred. She made a verbal connection. He knows. That wasn't random. It was a moment of emotional recognition. He saved her, and somewhere inside, she remembered him. The defense objected, arguing it was pure emotional manipulation. But Judge Ramirez shut it down. The testimony is rooted in professional psychological analysis. Objection overruled. Dr. Bennett continued. And once that door opened, Lila's memories followed. She wasn't fed any details. No one prompted her about a ring, or a green light, or the scent of dirt. That came from her. And all of it was verified by the physical evidence found in the farmhouse. The most powerful moment came when the prosecutor presented a photo from the crime scene. The trapdoor, worn and scratched, with claw marks embedded in the wood. They were small, but deep Rexes. The officer who processed the scene had documented them. Never imagining they'd become critical in a courtroom months later, the prosecutor turned to the jury. This is not a story told by adults. This is not an invented narrative. This is a 3-year-old child who, without knowing any legal process, matched multiple pieces of evidence. And all she needed was to see the dog who saved her. But it wasn't until the judge called a brief recess that the emotional floodgates opened. As the jury was being let out, Lila, who had been watching through the glass of the witness prep room, spotted Rex and began tapping on the window. Officer Mallory noticed, stepped out, and brought Rex down the hallway toward her. The bailiff gave a subtle nod, allowing the interaction to happen. When Rex reached Lila, she dropped her stuffed bear and wrapped her arms around his neck. Then, with tears in her eyes, she said something no one expected. "Can he stay with me? Forever?" The hallway grew silent. Officer Mallory crouched beside her. "He's going to retire soon, Lila. And I think he'd like that very much." News of the moment reached the courtroom within minutes. And when the jury returned, their faces had changed. They had seen the evidence. But now they had felt the weight of it. Rex wasn't just a police dog. He was living proof, and the little girl, who once said nothing at all, had spoken words that were now impossible to ignore. The courthouse was silent, almost reverent, as the clerk stood and unfolded the verdict slip. The jury had been gone for only 6 hours. Some thought it would take days. Others believed it would be a hung jury. But what no one could deny was that the emotional tide had shifted. A little girl's memory, sparked by a loyal police dog, had turned whispers of uncertainty into something far more real, something undeniable. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Ramirez said, her voice steady. Daniel Mercer stood slowly, his hands folded in front of him, his face pale. Throughout the trial, he had kept a steady, unreadable expression. But now, in this moment, even he seemed uncertain. His lawyer shifted nervously beside him, whispering something under his breath. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a calm tone, read aloud. "We, the jury, in the case of the state versus Daniel Mercer, find the defendant guilty on all counts." Gasps rang out across the courtroom. Some spectators cried quietly. A reporter dropped their pen, but at the defense table, Daniel Mercer's body tensed. For the first time in weeks, his composure cracked. He looked toward the gallery, not for sympathy, but for understanding, as if trying to grasp what had just happened. His lawyer slumped slightly, defeated. There would be appeals, no doubt, but the damage had been done. The judge nodded solemnly. "The court thanks the jury for its service. Sentencing will be scheduled within 30 days. Mercer was escorted away in silence. But that wasn't the end. Moments after the verdict was read, the prosecutor stood and asked the judge for permission to make a special statement on record. With the court's approval, Donna Weller began. "I would like to acknowledge the bravery of one individual who cannot testify, but whose presence changed the course of this case. Officer Rex, a police K-9, not only assisted in the original rescue of a minor, but also played a direct role in restoring her ability to speak, allowing justice to be served." The judge smiled softly. "Permission granted. The court commends." Officer Rex for his extraordinary service. In the gallery, Leela sat next to her child advocate, holding her bear in one hand and resting the other on Rex's back. She didn't seem to fully grasp the weight of the verdict, but she could feel the shift in energy. People weren't sad anymore. They weren't afraid. For the first time in a long while, they were looking forward. After the court adjourned, cameras were not allowed, but a small group was invited into the press room for a private statement. Officer Mallory stood beside Rex as microphones were lowered in front of him. Rex is set to retire within the next 3 months, he announced. His service record is spotless. And with today's outcome, the department has officially approved a transfer of care. He looked toward Lila, who stood beside him with wide eyes. Pending final approval from the Child Services Office, Rex will be rehomed with the young girl he rescued, permanently. The room broke into soft applause. Reporters wiped away tears. Even the toughest detective in the corner gave a small nod of approval outside the courthouse. Crowds had gathered. Some carried signs thanking the police. Others simply stood with hands over their mouths, moved by what had happened. But inside, away from all the noise, Lila did something no one expected. She knelt beside Rex, whispered something in his ear, and then looked up and said clearly, "You can come home now." Then just like that, a case that began with silence and shadows ended with something much brighter: truth, healing, and the promise of safety. Rex didn't bark. He didn't move, but in his quiet way, he knew his job was done. And now, something even better was beginning. 3 weeks after the verdict, the Jefferson County Courthouse looked very different. The crowds had cleared. The reporters had moved on. The tension and whispers that once hung in the air had faded into memory. But inside a quiet side room of the police department, something far more meaningful was happening. Something no headline could truly capture. Rex sat patiently by the desk of Officer Mallory, wearing a brand new collar with a gold badge engraved into the leather. On it were the words, "Rex, Service, Loyalty, Hero." His ears perked slightly as the door opened. Lila entered the room, her tiny backpack bouncing on her shoulders and her ever-present stuffed bear tucked beneath her arm. Her caseworker, Jenna, stood close behind, smiling with quiet pride. Mallory knelt beside Rex and looked up at Lila. "Well, kiddo, I think someone's been waiting for you." Lila didn't hesitate. She dropped her bear, ran straight to Rex, and wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Rex responded instantly, pressing his head gently against her shoulder, tail wagging in slow, steady rhythm. The paperwork had already been finalized. After weeks of evaluation, therapy reviews, and coordination with the department, Rex had officially been retired from active service and placed into the care of Lila's guardian family. With the support of her therapist and social worker, Lila would now be growing up with the one being she had first trusted when no one else could reach her. A small ceremony was held that afternoon in the precinct's community room. There were no TV cameras, no media, just the officers who'd worked the case, a few city officials, and the people who had stood by Lila throughout the trial. At the front of the room was a small stage, and standing at the center was a plaque mounted with Rex's old badge. When Judge Ramirez stepped up to speak, even she seemed moved. "There are rare moments," she said, "when justice isn't just about the law. It's about healing. It's about humanity. And sometimes it's about a bond that defies explanation. Today, we honor one of the finest police officers I've ever encountered, who also happens to have 4 legs." The room chuckled gently, and she continued. "Rex not only helped bring justice, he gave a little girl her voice back. And in doing so, reminded us all that courage doesn't always come with a uniform or a title. Sometimes it comes with fur, patience, and an open heart." When it was Lila's turn to speak, no one expected much. She was only 3. But when Officer Mallory gently nudged her forward and she stood on a small step stool beside the podium. What she said next stayed with everyone in the room. "I was in the dark," she said quietly, "and he found me. Now I'm not in the dark anymore. I'm safe, because of Rex." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the ceremony, as the room emptied out, Lila sat with Rex on the floor beside the plaque. Her social worker gave her space while she played with the dog, feeding him a small treat and brushing his fur with soft, careful hands. "I think he likes being home," she whispered to herself, as if the whole world had finally returned to its right place. Rex gave a soft grunt of agreement and rested his head on her lap. Though the trial had ended, a new journey was beginning for Lila, for her healing, and for a retired police dog who had given more than any officer could be asked to give. In the months that followed, Lila's progress continued. She began speaking more regularly. Her nightmares became fewer. Her drawings turned from dark scribbles to bright colors, many of them featuring her and Rex playing in gardens or riding in police cars. And through it all, Rex remained at her side, a silent protector, a forever friend, a hero now home.